Before we start the story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. I'd hoped that the redwoods would give me peace. After the past year, after the trial, the broken friendships, the endless nights haunted by what I'd done, I thought maybe some time alone in nature would help me find myself again, or at least help me forget. But as I sat by the creek on that first night, listening to the babbling water and staring at the impossibly tall trees around me, I realized the silence wasn't the comfort I thought it'd be. It was a void, an empty space that made it hard to think, let alone relax. I leaned back in my camp chair, glancing over at the RV. Its roof barely cleared the tops of the ferns that seemed to grow everywhere in this forest. The towering redwoods loomed overhead, blocking out most of the sky. The air was heavy with fog, and the sound of the creek was constant, a gentle rushing that should have been soothing, but instead, it felt unnerving. Too steady, too close. Maybe Adam was right. Maybe I shouldn't have taken off on my own like this, but I needed it. I needed the space to think, to forget about the wreckage of my career, my life. I'd dragged too many people down with me in the end, and I wasn't about to let them drag me down with them any further. I had been here for 2 days, camped by a small, nameless creek far from the trails, isolated and quiet. The place was beautiful, sure, but there was something else in the air, something that felt off, like the forest didn't want me there. I shook my head, standing and tossing the last of my coffee onto the campfire. I'd been reading too many conspiracy blogs again. Maybe Adam's obsession with the supernatural was rubbing off on me. I couldn't afford that, not when I was trying to clear my head. As the fire crackled and died, I grabbed my journal and headed inside the RV. The heater was on the fritz again, sputtering out cold air more often than not, but at least the small space felt enclosed, safe. I sat down at the little fold-out table and opened my notebook, staring at the blank page. I was supposed to be writing a new story, something that would take me away from my past as an investigative journalist and get me back on my feet. But nothing came. The page stayed empty, mocking me. It was only when the fire outside sputtered and went out with a final hiss that I realized how quiet the forest had become. The creek, which had been flowing steadily just a few feet away all day, was suddenly silent. I paused, the pen frozen in my hand. My heart started to beat faster and I listened. Nothing. No water, no wind, not even the distant call of birds or the rustling of ferns. Just silence. I set the pen down, slowly, trying to convince myself that the water had just slowed for some reason. Maybe a fallen branch had blocked it upstream. There was an explanation. There had to be. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the cold evening air. The fog had thickened, swirling between the trees like smoke. I walked over to where the creek should have been, the beam of my flashlight bouncing off the trees and ferns. But when I reached the creek bed, I stopped cold. The water was gone. I knelt down, shining the light over the dry, cracked earth where the creek had flowed just hours before. There was no water, no moisture at all. It was as if the creek had never been there. What the hell? I stood up, glancing around as a cold breeze blew through the trees, sending a shiver down my spine. This didn't make sense. A creek doesn't just vanish. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I turned slowly, the flashlight's beam cutting through the thickening fog. The trees loomed over me, their bark twisted and ancient, their branches like fingers stretching toward the sky. The silence pressed in around me, heavy and suffocating. My breath came out in small, frosty puffs, the temperature suddenly much colder than it had been earlier. Then I heard it, a whisper, faint, barely audible but unmistakable. "Danny!" I froze. My heart slammed in my chest and I spun around, shining the flashlight in the direction of the voice. Nothing, just trees. But the voice had been there. I was sure of it. Low, soft, like someone calling my name from a distance, but no one was there. I was alone. I backed up, the dry creek bed crunching under my boots, and hurried toward the RV, the flashlight beam jerking wildly as I went. The silence followed me all the way to the door, pressing in on me like a physical weight. Once inside, I slammed the door shut and locked it, leaning against it for a moment to catch my breath. My heart was still racing, my mind trying to make sense of what had just happened. The creek was gone. The voice? Maybe it was the wind. Yeah, just the wind. The fog could play tricks on your mind, right? I turned off the flashlight and sat down at the table, my hands shaking slightly. I grabbed the notebook again, flipping through the pages aimlessly, trying to calm my nerves. Then the whispers started again. This time, they were louder. I could hear them outside moving through the trees, circling the RV. Danny! I stood up, my pulse hammering in my ears. The voice was unmistakable now, clear as day. It was calling my name, drawing closer. I yanked the blinds down on the windows, trying to shut out whatever was outside, but the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, surrounding me, until I felt like they were inside my head. Danny, come outside. I grabbed my jacket and threw it on, not thinking, just reacting. I was going to confront whoever, or whatever, was out there. I wasn't going to let my mind spiral into paranoia. I yanked the door open and stepped outside, the cold air biting at my face. But the forest was empty. The fog hung thick and low, swirling around the trees like a shroud. The whispers were gone, replaced once again by the suffocating silence. I stepped forward cautiously, scanning the trees with my flashlight. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and hollow in the vast emptiness. "Who's there?" Nothing. Just the fog and the trees. I moved toward the creek bed again, hoping for some kind of explanation. But when I reached it, I stopped dead in my tracks. The creek was back. Water flowed gently over the rocks, the sound as steady and calming as it had been the day before. The dry bed was gone, replaced by the cool rush of water. I knelt down, running my fingers through the water, expecting it to vanish under my touch. But it was real. The creek was there, as if it had never disappeared. I stood up slowly, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't staying here another night. I turned to head back to the RV when I saw her. A figure stood at the edge of the fog, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. She was tall and slender, her hair long and dark, her face hidden in shadow. "Mia?" I called out, recognizing the park ranger I'd met when I first arrived. "Is that you?" She didn't move, didn't respond. She just stood there, watching me, her silhouette barely visible through the thick fog. I started toward her, but as I got closer, something about her felt wrong. Her posture was too stiff, her presence too still. And as I closed the distance between us, I realized she wasn't standing on the ground. She was floating. Her feet hovered a few inches above the earth, her body swaying gently in the wind. A cold wave of fear washed over me, and I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. "Mia?" The figure didn't move, didn't speak, and then, just as quickly as she'd appeared, she vanished, dissolving into the fog like smoke. I bolted back to the RV, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking as I locked it, my heart racing in my chest. What the hell was that? I sat down at the table, staring at the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the whispers didn't return, and the forest outside remained deathly quiet. For hours, I sat there, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it all. The vanishing creek, the voices, the figure in the fog. None of it made any sense. When morning finally came, I didn't waste any time. I packed up the RV and got the hell out of there, my hands still shaking as I drove down the narrow, winding road through the redwoods. I didn't look back. As I drove, I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something standing at the edge of the road watching me. But there was nothing. Nothing except the faint sound of water rushing somewhere deep in the forest, and a whisper. We should have turned back the second the wind started howling. That's what I keep telling myself now, after everything. But Chris didn't believe in omens. To him, it was just another stop on our endless tour of thrill-seeking adventures. Monument Valley was supposed to be our last hurrah, one final trip before life got in the way, before he proposed to Sarah, before I settled into my job back east. But instead of some wild memory to look back on, all I have left are the nightmares. The desert didn't scare me. I'd been to remote places before, hiked into national parks, camped alone on the edge of the wild, but there was something about Monument Valley that felt different. It wasn't the towering rock formations that looked like fingers reaching toward the sky, or the vast, silent spaces between them. It was something in the air, a weight, a presence I couldn't shake. We arrived late, parking the RV near a lone butte on the northern edge of the valley. Chris had found the spot online, some blog post about secret camping locations where tourists wouldn't bother you. Untouched wilderness, he'd said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. I wasn't so sure. There's untouched, and then there's unwanted. And this place felt like the latter. I didn't like the way the sun dipped below the horizon that first night. It seemed to vanish too fast, like something was in a hurry to cloak the land in darkness. The wind picked up almost immediately after, howling through the rocks, and for a second I swore I heard voices in it, whispers too faint to make out. I was about to tell Chris when he interrupted my thoughts. "Man, it's perfect here, right? No tourists, no noise, just us and the desert." He was grinning as he set up the fire pit, completely oblivious to my unease. "Yeah, perfect," I muttered, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread gnawing at my gut. I helped him unpack, trying to distract myself from the strange chill in the air. By the time we got the fire going, the temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees. Too fast for a desert in autumn, I thought. As we sat by the fire, Chris launched into another one of his stories, something about the time he nearly fell off a cliff while hiking in Colorado. I tried to listen, but my attention kept drifting back to the wind. It sounded almost human, like it was carrying something with it, words that weren't meant for us. Then came the howl, a long, mournful cry that cut through the air like a knife. My stomach tightened, and I glanced at Chris. He just shrugged. "Coyote," he said, poking the fire with a stick. "You ever hear one this close before?" "No," I admitted, the unease returning full force. "But that didn't sound right. It sounded off." Chris laughed, shaking his head. "You're always so damn paranoid. Relax, we're in the middle of nowhere. Nothing's out here except some wildlife." But it didn't feel like wildlife. And the longer I sat there, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching us from the shadows just beyond the firelight. We turned in early that night, though I barely slept. I kept hearing those howls, closer, then farther, then closer again. At one point, I swore I heard my name whispered outside the RV, but when I got up to check, there was nothing. Just the endless desert, silent except for the wind. The next morning, Chris wanted to explore. There was an old trail nearby that led deeper into the valley, away from the few tourist spots and into the more isolated parts of Navajo land. I wasn't thrilled about it, but there was no stopping Chris when he got an idea in his head. As we hiked, I noticed something strange. There were tracks in the sand, human at first, but they changed the further we walked. The footprints got longer, more animalistic, like something had started out walking on 2 legs but had shifted to 4. I pointed it out to Chris. "Dude, that's just an animal," he said, brushing it off. "You're reading too much into it." But I knew what I was looking at. Something wasn't right. The day passed in a blur of heat and red rock. By the time we got back to the RV, the sun was dipping low again, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Chris seemed more energized than ever, but I couldn't shake the growing tension in my chest. That night, things got worse. The wind started up again, more insistent this time, as if it were pressing against the RV, trying to get in. I could hear it moving outside, rustling through the brush, and then came the knock, soft at first, barely audible. I sat up in my bunk, my heart racing. It came again, this time louder. I looked over at Chris. He was sound asleep. "Chris," I whispered, shaking him awake. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" he mumbled, his eyes half closed. "The knocking. Someone's outside." He groaned, sitting up and rubbing his face. "There's no one out here, man. It's probably just the wind." But it wasn't the wind. I knew that. I got up, grabbing the flashlight, and opened the door just a crack. The beam swept across the empty desert, landing on nothing. No one was there. No tracks in the sand. No sign of movement. Just the vast emptiness of Monument Valley. Chris sighed. "See? Nothing. Go back to sleep." But I couldn't sleep. Not after that. And things only got stranger as the night wore on. I kept hearing it. Whispers, faint and distant, but unmistakably human. They carried on the wind, circling the RV like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Around 2 a.m. I heard something else. A voice, low and guttural, calling my name from outside. "Jason." I froze. It was Chris's voice, but Chris was asleep. I glanced over at him, still snoring in his bunk. The voice called again, louder this time, more insistent. "Jason, come outside." My hand tightened around the flashlight as I moved toward the door. I was about to open it when a thought stopped me cold. If that was Chris's voice outside, then who was sleeping in the RV with me? I backed away from the door, heart pounding in my chest. The voice called out one last time, but this time it wasn't Chris's voice at all. It was something else, something not human. The tone was too low, too wrong, as if it were trying to imitate a voice it didn't understand. "Jason?" I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting in the corner of the RV with my back against the wall, watching the door. The wind didn't let up, and neither did the whispers. By morning, I was exhausted, but I didn't say anything to Chris. He was in a good mood, oblivious to what had happened. I decided not to tell him. He wouldn't believe me anyway. Later that day, things took a turn for the worse. We'd been driving deeper into the valley when the RV's engine sputtered and died. Chris cursed, popping the hood and messing with the wires, but nothing worked. We were stuck. "It's fine," he said, wiping the sweat from his brow. "We'll figure it out." But I didn't feel fine. I felt trapped, like something was closing in on us. And then I saw it. The coyote. It was sitting about 50 yards away, staring at us with unblinking yellow eyes. There was something unnatural about the way it held itself. Too still, too aware. It didn't move as I stared back at it, my skin crawling. "Hey, check this out," I said, nudging Chris. He glanced over and shrugged. "It's just a coyote, man." But it wasn't just a coyote. I could feel it watching us, waiting. That night, things reached their breaking point. I woke up to find Chris gone. His bunk was empty, and the RV door was wide open. Panic surged through me as I grabbed the flashlight and ran outside. My beam cut through the darkness, landing on a figure standing far out near the rocks. It was Chris, standing perfectly still, staring out into the desert. "Chris!" I shouted, running toward him. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. Chris didn't move. He didn't even blink. His face was blank, expressionless, as if he were in a trance. I reached out to grab his shoulder, but the second I touched him, he vanished. 1 second he was there, and the next, gone. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The wind howled around me, and I swore I heard laughter in it, low, mocking laughter. I ran back to the RV, slamming the door behind me. Chris was lying in his bunk, sound asleep, as if nothing had happened. The next morning, Chris was different. He didn't say much, just stared off into the distance with that same blank expression. I tried talking to him, but it was like he wasn't there anymore. And then, that night, it all fell apart. I woke to the sound of scratching outside the RV, followed by that same voice. Chris's voice calling my name. I grabbed the flashlight and looked outside. The coyote was standing there again, but this time it was different. It was standing on 2 legs, its body twisted and grotesque, its eyes glowing in the dark. It smiled. I backed away, the flashlight shaking in my hands. The creature's mouth moved and Chris's voice came out, distorted and wrong. "Jason, let me in." I screamed, slamming the door shut and locking it, but I knew it wouldn't hold. The thing outside wasn't going to stop. By morning, Chris was gone. Not the Chris I knew, but the empty shell of him. I found him outside, digging at the ground with his bare hands, muttering something about giving something back to the land. I ran. I don't know how, but the RV started again. I drove as fast as I could, not daring to look back. Chris never made it out of Monument Valley, at least not the Chris I knew. I can still hear his voice sometimes in the wind. I didn't believe in ghosts. At least, I didn't until that week in Allegheny National Forest. It was supposed to be just another trip, a way to clear my head after the divorce, spend some time in the woods, and maybe get drunk around a campfire with Adam like we used to in college. No one said anything about a haunted forest, but that's what I get for listening to Adam. We drove into the forest early in the morning, the fog still clinging to the treetops, making the woods seem endless. It was late October, and the air had that bite to it, the kind that made your breath hang in the air just long enough to remind you winter was coming. Adam was in the passenger seat, his nose buried in a map he didn't need. He'd been spouting off ghost stories since we left Pittsburgh, each one wilder than the last. "Did you know the locals believe this place is cursed?" he asked, tracing a line on the map with his finger. I rolled my eyes. "You've been reading too many of those weird blogs again, haven't you?" "I'm serious, man. There's all kinds of stories about this place. People getting lost, hearing voices, seeing things that aren't really there. That's called being in the woods, Adam. People get lost. They hear animals. It's not a curse." He grinned, shaking his head. "You always have to be the skeptic, don't you? You always have to be the guy who thinks every tree has a ghost behind it." We argued like this for most of the drive. That was part of the appeal of camping with Adam. He was good at getting me out of my head, distracting me from the reality I didn't want to face. And right now, reality was a messy divorce and an empty apartment back home. The RV bounced over the rough forest road as we neared the site Adam had picked out. It was miles from anywhere, deep in the heart of Allegheny, near a secluded lake he'd read about online. Perfect for fishing, he'd said. Perfect for some peace and quiet, I thought. When we finally parked, the place was beautiful. Tall trees stretched endlessly in every direction, their leaves turning gold and red, the forest floor thick with fallen foliage. The lake was still, like glass, reflecting the sky and the surrounding woods. And, most importantly, we were alone. No other campers, no crowds, no noise, just the forest. "This is it," Adam said, stepping out of the RV and taking a deep breath. "Can you feel it? The energy?" what I feel is the cold. Help me get the fire going." The first night was uneventful, aside from Adam's constant jabbering about the ghosts of Allegheny. I tuned him out for the most part, focusing instead on the sound of the fire crackling and the wind rustling through the trees. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The divorce, the anger, the loneliness, all of it felt distant out here. I thought this trip might actually do me some good. That was before the footsteps. It was late, probably close to midnight. Adam had gone to bed, but I was still sitting by the fire, nursing a beer and staring out into the dark forest. That's when I heard it. Soft at first, like someone was walking around the RV, trying not to be heard. My first thought was deer. They're everywhere around here and they're sneaky as hell. But as the sound grew louder, I started to get this feeling that it wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too human. Footsteps, crunching through the leaves, circling the campsite. "Adam," I called out, but the only answer I got was the wind. I grabbed the flashlight and stood up, the beam cutting through the darkness as I scanned the trees. Nothing. Just the empty woods and the distant shimmer of the lake. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. I shook my head, trying to shake off the unease. "It's just the woods," I muttered to myself. "Nothing out there but trees." The footsteps didn't return, and after a while I convinced myself it was just my imagination. A mix of the quiet and Adam's ghost stories getting to me. I put out the fire and went to bed, but I didn't sleep much. The next day, Adam convinced me to go on a hike. He'd found an old trail leading deeper into the woods, one that wasn't on the map. It was the kind of place that felt like no one had been there in years. The trees so thick that barely any light made it through. I didn't love the idea, but Adam's enthusiasm had always been contagious. "You're gonna love this," he said as we trudged along the narrow path. "This is real wilderness. No people, no signs, just the forest." Yeah, it's real all right, real quiet. It was too quiet, in fact. No birds, no insects, nothing but the sound of our boots on the leaves. The further we went, the more oppressive the silence became. I started to feel like we were being watched, but every time I turned around, there was nothing, just trees. After about an hour of hiking, we stumbled across an old cabin. At least, it had been a cabin once. Now, it was little more than a pile of rotting wood and collapsed beams, the walls covered in moss and vines. Adam's eyes lit up. "See? This is the kind of place I was talking about. Bet this place has some stories. Looks like it's about to fall over." We poked around the ruins for a bit, Adam more excited than I was. There wasn't much left inside, just the remains of an old stove, some broken furniture, and what looked like the remnants of a journal, its pages waterlogged and torn. Adam picked it up, carefully flipping through the brittle pages. "Check this out," he said, his voice suddenly serious. "This guy was writing about a spirit. Says it followed him through the woods, whispered his name, tried to get him lost." I laughed. "Of course he did. Probably just some crazy old man." But Adam didn't laugh. "There's more. He says the spirit, it tried to make him leave something behind, something important, like a trade. Let me guess, it was his soul. No, seriously, man. He says the spirit was looking for something it lost." I rolled my eyes and started back toward the trail. Let's get back to the RV. It's getting late. That night, the footsteps came back. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside the RV, just like before. But this time, they were louder, closer. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest, straining to hear. The footsteps circled the RV, slow and deliberate, like whoever, or whatever, was out there wanted me to know they were there. I looked over at Adam, still asleep, snoring softly in his bunk. I grabbed the flashlight again and opened the door just a crack, shining the beam outside. Nothing. Just the trees and the fog rolling in from the lake. I stepped outside, the cold air hitting me like a slap in the face. The silence was suffocating, and the fog was thick, curling around the trees like smoke. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast emptiness. "Anyone out there?" No answer. I stood there for a minute, listening, my breath hanging in the air. Then, just as I was about to go back inside, I heard it. A whisper. Faint, almost too quiet to hear, but unmistakable. "Nick?" I froze, my blood turned into ice. The voice was distant, but it sounded familiar. Too familiar. "Nick." It was my name, whispered again, carried on the wind. But it wasn't Adam's voice. It was something else. Something wrong. I bolted back into the RV, locking the door behind me. My heart was racing, my mind trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. Maybe it was a trick of the wind, or maybe Adam had been messing with me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I barely slept the rest of the night, the whisper echoing in my mind. The next morning, Adam was unusually quiet. He didn't mention the footsteps or the whispering, and I wasn't about to bring it up. Instead, he spent most of the day poring over the journal we'd found at the cabin, reading aloud parts that didn't make much sense to me. By the time the sun started to set, the fog had rolled in thick, blanketing the forest and the lake in a gray haze. I tried to shake the uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at me since the night before, but it wasn't going away. "I'm going to head back to the cabin tomorrow," Adam said suddenly. "There's something about that place. I need to check it out again." I frowned. We're supposed to be relaxing, not hunting for ghosts. Relaxing's boring. Besides, aren't you curious? There's something weird going on here, man. I'd rather not find out what. But Adam wouldn't listen. He was already packing his bag for the hike back to the cabin, his eyes gleaming with that familiar excitement. I knew there was no stopping him when he got like this, so I didn't bother arguing. That night, Adam went missing. I woke up to the RV door wide open, cold air flooding the small space. I jumped out of bed, calling his name, but there was no answer. His bag was gone, his bed empty. Panic surged through me as I grabbed the flashlight and ran outside, my breath coming in quick, sharp bursts. "Adam!" I shouted into the fog, but the only response was the wind. I sprinted toward the woods, my flashlight beam cutting through the mist. I had no idea where I was going, but I couldn't stop. Not when my best friend was out there, lost. The further I went, the darker it got. The fog thickened, wrapping around the trees like a shroud, and soon I couldn't tell which way was which. The whispers started again, soft at first, then louder. "Nick." I stopped, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice wasn't Adam's. It wasn't anyone's. It was something else. "Nick, come here." I backed away, my hands shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The voice was getting closer, but I couldn't see anything, just the trees and the fog. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the trees. Tall, thin, and twisted, its face pale and gaunt, like something pulled from a nightmare. "Nick," it whispered again, the sound coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I ran. I don't remember how I found my way back to the RV. All I remember is running, the fog swallowing me whole, the whispers chasing me through the woods. By the time I reached the campsite, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting weak gray light through the trees. Adam never came back. I waited for hours, calling his name, but there was no sign of him, not even his tracks. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. I left Allegheny that day, but I've never stopped hearing the whispers. They follow me, even now, calling my name, reminding me that the forest doesn't forget. I used to laugh at ghost stories. They were fun around a campfire, sure, but I never bought into them. Monsters, spirits, things that go bump in the night. It was all just stuff made up to scare kids. At least, that's what I thought until the night we camped in Red River Gorge. That place changed everything. We were supposed to be reconnecting, having a fun weekend away from work and the endless grind. It was my idea, of course. I'm Josh, the outdoorsy one in the group. I've always loved getting off the grid, and I thought a trip to the gorge would be just the thing to remind us why we're all still friends. But things have a way of spiraling, and this trip spiraled harder than any of us could have imagined. The plan was simple. Park the RV in a secluded spot, hike some trails, enjoy the wilderness, and maybe get drunk around the campfire. But from the start, things went wrong. The first snag hit when we pulled into our campsite, if you could even call it that. We had parked miles from any other campers. Ben, my best friend, insisted on picking a remote spot, and I was all for it. We didn't need some noisy family or overzealous hiker cramping our style. But then, as we were setting up, we realized the RV's water tank was leaking. The hose had busted at some point, probably on the last trip. We didn't have enough water for the 3 days we planned to stay, and when we unpacked the tent for extra space, half the poles were missing. "I thought you checked all this stuff," Lisa said with that edge in her voice that always pissed me off. It didn't help that she was my ex. We hadn't been on the greatest terms since the breakup, but Ben, in his infinite wisdom, thought bringing her along would ease tensions. "I did check it," I snapped, knowing full well I hadn't. "The tent's fine. We'll just sleep in the RV. It's big enough." "For all 4 of us?" Lisa crossed her arms and glared at me. She always knew how to push my buttons. "We'll manage," I muttered. Ben and Sam, his girlfriend, stayed quiet. Sam tried to lighten the mood by pulling out her camera, talking about how perfect the gorge was for getting shots of wildlife. She was the peacekeeper in the group, always trying to smooth things over when Lisa and I got into it. Ben gave me a look, one that said, "Just let it go," but I wasn't about to start arguing with Lisa the first night. "Look, let's just get a fire going," I said. "We'll eat, relax, and forget about the stupid tent." By the time the fire was crackling, we had more or less settled in. Ben was poking the logs, keeping the flames high. Sam was fiddling with her camera, waiting for the light to fade so she could capture some stars. Lisa sat on a log, arms still crossed, staring at the fire like it owed her money. The woods around us were quiet. Too quiet, actually. I hadn't noticed it at first, but after the sun set, there were no sounds. No crickets, no birds, no rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was eerie, but I ignored it, figuring it was just the way things were out here. Besides, I wasn't about to admit I felt unsettled. "So," Ben started, trying to fill the silence, "did you know Red River Gorge has a bunch of legends attached to it?" "Oh, here we go," I groaned. Ben loved this stuff. Cryptids, ghosts, urban legends. He'd been into that kind of thing since we were kids. "Let me guess. Bigfoot lives here?" "No, man. Wendigo," he said, poking at the fire again. The flames flickered, casting long shadows on the trees around us. "It's an old Native American legend. A creature that used to be human but turned into this thing. It's cursed to wander the woods, hunting people because it's always starving." "That's just something they tell people to keep them out of the woods," I said. "Scare tactics? You think some monster's gonna come down here and eat us?" Ben shrugged. "I didn't say I believed it, but locals around here have reported weird stuff. Howling in the middle of the night, people going missing, claw marks on trees. Who knows?" Lisa rolled her eyes, but Sam looked a little spooked. I could tell she didn't want to hear about monsters while we were miles away from civilization. "Come on, Ben," Sam said, managing a nervous laugh. "Don't freak me out on our first night. I'm just saying, it's a cool story." I laughed it off, tossed a few more logs onto the fire, and changed the subject. But deep down, that quiet was gnawing at me. There should have been something, anything, making noise in the woods. We were still sitting around the fire when the first sound came. A howl, long, low, and echoing through the trees. Sam froze mid-sentence, her hand gripping her camera. "Did you hear that?" "It's probably just a coyote," I said, though the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. "That didn't sound like a coyote," Ben muttered. We listened for a few minutes, waiting, but nothing came again. No more howling. I pushed it out of my mind. That night, we crammed into the RV, but I couldn't sleep. Lisa was tossing and turning, muttering in her sleep, and the air inside felt thick. It wasn't just the heat. It was like something heavy was pressing down on me. I tried to shut my eyes and force myself to rest, but every little creak and groan of the RV had me on edge. And that silence. It was like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. I must have dozed off at some point, but when I woke up it was still dark. Except now there was a scratching sound. Faint, like nails on metal. At first I thought it was a branch scraping against the RV, but the more I listened, the clearer it became. It was deliberate, slow, and coming from outside. I glanced at Ben, who was lying on the other side of the RV, eyes wide open. He must have heard it too. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Ben nodded, eyes darting to the door. Suddenly, there was a knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps. The RV rocked slightly, like something large was moving around outside. My pulse quickened. I grabbed the flashlight beside me and stood up, trying to ignore the way my hands were shaking. "I'm gonna check it out," I whispered to Ben. "No, man," he hissed. "Stay inside. Don't be stupid." But I was already at the door. Part of me was terrified, but another part of me was angry. Angry that something out there was screwing with us. Probably some locals trying to scare campers. I wasn't about to let some redneck pranksters ruin our trip. I stepped out into the night, flashlight beam sweeping the trees. The fire from earlier had died down to a pile of glowing embers, casting weak light over the campsite. The forest around us was still. No wind, no movement. Nothing. I took a step toward the trees, scanning the area. The air felt thick, oppressive, like it was harder to breathe out here. Then, just at the edge of the trees, I saw it. A shape. At first, I thought it was a deer, but no deer stands on 2 legs. The figure was tall, too tall, its limbs long and thin, almost skeletal. It moved silently, slipping behind a tree before I could get a good look at it. "Josh, get back in here," Ben whispered harshly from the door. I didn't need any more convincing. I backed up slowly, keeping the flashlight trained on the trees, then jumped back into the RV, slamming the door shut behind me. "What the hell was that?" Ben whispered, eyes wide. "I don't know," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. "I saw something. It wasn't human." Lisa stirred in her sleep, and I glanced at her, but she didn't wake up. Sam shifted too, mumbling something about her camera. "We need to get out of here," Ben said. "Now." "It's probably just some animal," I said, though I didn't believe it. "We'll leave in the morning." But morning didn't come soon enough. I don't know how long we sat there listening to every little sound. But eventually, the scratching came again, louder this time. And then the voice, my own voice. "Josh, come outside." I froze. It was me, but it wasn't. The tone was off, like something was trying to imitate me. Ben paled, his hand tightening around the flashlight. "Josh, come outside," the voice called again, more insistent this time. "I need you." I stood up, gripping the flashlight tightly. Ben grabbed my arm. "Don't do it, man," he said, his voice shaky. "That's not you." "I know," I whispered. "I know." I stayed inside, my heart racing, trying to drown out the sound of my own voice calling to me from the darkness. The voice faded eventually, but we didn't sleep. We couldn't. When dawn finally broke, the air still felt heavy. We stepped out of the RV cautiously, eyes scanning the campsite for any signs of what had happened last night. The ground was disturbed. Deep claw marks ran across the side of the RV, and strange symbols were burned into the earth near the fire pit. "What the hell is this?" Sam whispered, pointing at the symbols. Her hands were shaking. "Who did this?" "No one did this," Ben said quietly. "It wasn't human." We packed up quickly, throwing everything into the RV without talking. There was no way we were staying another night in that place. I started the engine, my hands still trembling, and we took off down the dirt road, leaving Red River Gorge behind. But as we drove away, I heard one last howl, long and low, echoing through the trees like a warning or a promise. Whatever it was still out there. And I knew, deep down, that I'd never come back. Even now, weeks later, that howl haunts my dreams. I don't tell people about what happened out there. They'd never believe me. Hell, I barely believe it myself. But I know what I saw, and I know that some places aren't meant to be disturbed. Some legends aren't just stories. Camping has always been my way to unwind. There's something about getting off the grid, away from the noise and chaos of life, that settles me. So, when Sam suggested a trip to the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest, I was all for it. A week away from work, phones, and any responsibilities seemed like exactly what I needed. Plus, I hadn't seen Sam and his girlfriend Kelly in months. We were overdue for a proper catch-up. The plan was simple. Drive out to the National Forest in my RV, set up camp deep enough to avoid any tourists, and spend our days hiking, fishing, and telling stories around the fire. The perfect getaway. What could go wrong? I should have listened to my gut the moment Sam started talking about skinwalkers. I mean, I'd heard of them before, Native American shapeshifters that could take the form of animals or people. But it was just folklore, right? People like Sam, who'd spent way too many hours on conspiracy forums, ate that stuff up. He wouldn't shut up about it. "Jake, I'm telling you, man, there have been sightings out here," Sam said, leaning forward from the back seat. His eyes sparkled with excitement as he rattled off supposed encounters. People have seen them. Wolves that turn into men, voices calling from the trees. It's real. "Yeah, sure, just like Bigfoot," I muttered, rolling my eyes. "It's a forest, Sam. It's supposed to be full of creepy noises. Doesn't mean anything's out there." Kelly shot me a glance from the passenger seat, half amused, half annoyed. "You know he won't stop until he's scared us all senseless, right?" Sam chuckled, clearly pleased with himself. "Hey, it's just for fun. You don't believe in anything until it happens to you." That was the thing about Sam. He never took anything seriously. He was the kind of guy who would laugh in the face of danger, and for most of our lives, I'd been the one to reel him back in. The level-headed one. The skeptic. But as we drove deeper into the forest, something about the towering pines and endless stretches of wilderness made me uneasy. The air felt heavier, as if the trees themselves were watching us. After a couple of hours, we found a spot miles away from the nearest trailhead. It was perfect. Isolated, quiet, with a small clearing to park the RV and set up camp. But it didn't take long for things to start going wrong. The first issue hit when I realized that one of the tent poles was busted. Just like that, we were down to one tent for 3 people. I offered to sleep in the RV, but that didn't stop the bickering between Sam and Kelly. She didn't exactly appreciate his laid-back attitude toward the whole thing. "Seriously, Sam, you didn't check this before we left?" Kelly snapped, shaking the broken pole at him. "It's not like I planned this, Kel. We'll make it work. We've got the RV, right?" I set up the fire, tuning out the tension that hung between them. As the sun started to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing, I caught myself staring out into the forest more often than I'd like to admit. The sky darkened quickly, and soon the woods seemed to swallow everything beyond the reach of our firelight. That's when the first howl came. At first, I thought it was just a wolf, distant but close enough to hear. It echoed through the trees, low and drawn out, almost like a scream. Sam looked up, eyes glinting in the firelight. "That's gotta be a coyote, right?" Kelly asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "Sounds bigger than that," I said, poking the fire. "Probably just a wolf." "You sure?" Sam asked, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Because that's exactly what a skinwalker sounds like." I shot him a look. "Cut it out, Sam. It's just an animal." "Hey, I'm just saying. First sign of something weird, right? Shapeshifters, Jake. I warned you." I laughed it off, but I could tell Kelly wasn't amused. She'd grown quiet, staring out into the dark woods. Her fingers fidgeted nervously with the edge of her jacket. I tried to shake off the creeping unease, chalking it up to the isolation and the strange noises of the forest. But later that night, things escalated. I woke up to something moving outside the tent. It wasn't the soft rustle of leaves or the occasional snapping of a branch. It was deliberate. Footsteps. I held my breath, listening. There it was again, closer this time. "Sam," I whispered, nudging him awake. "Huh? What is it?" he mumbled, half asleep. "Listen." He sat up, his face serious now as the footsteps circled the tent. They stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural growl. I grabbed the flashlight and flicked it on, the beam slicing through the darkness. Nothing. Just the trees, standing tall and still. What the hell was that? Kelly's voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know," I muttered. "Probably just a wolf. Go back to sleep." But deep down, I didn't believe my own words. Those weren't the sounds of an animal. Not exactly. Something felt off. The next morning, the unease lingered. We found strange tracks circling the campsite. Large, like a wolf's, but with an odd gait. They changed halfway around the perimeter, turning into what looked like human footprints. Barefoot. "Okay, that's just weird," Kelly said, her voice tight with tension. "I don't like this, Jake. What if it's probably just some animal messing with us? Tracks can look strange when the ground's uneven," I said, trying to sound confident. But even I wasn't sure. Not after what we'd heard last night. Sam's eyes lit up. Or maybe it's exactly what I said it was. Skinwalker. "Jesus, Sam, this isn't funny anymore," I snapped. "We need to be careful out here. Let's just stick close to camp today, all right?" But Sam was already grabbing his gear, ready to explore deeper into the forest. "You guys stay here if you want. I'm going to check out that ridge we passed earlier. Maybe I'll get a glimpse of our visitor." Kelly begged him to stay, but Sam was already gone, disappearing into the trees with a mischievous grin on his face. I cursed under my breath and started packing up what little we'd brought out. If Sam wasn't back by noon, I'd go after him. The hours crawled by, and the forest seemed to grow heavier with silence. Even the birds had stopped singing. Kelly paced nervously around the camp, glancing toward the tree line every few minutes. "He's fine," I told her, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. Around noon, Sam finally returned, but something about him was off. He seemed distant, his face pale, and his usual cocky attitude was gone. "You all right?" I asked, trying to read his expression. "Yeah," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. "Just saw something weird out there." "What did you see?" Kelly asked, her voice anxious. Sam shook his head. "I don't know. Thought it was a deer at first, but it moved weird, fast. Then it was just gone." For the rest of the day, Sam barely said a word, which was unlike him. Kelly seemed relieved. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something was wrong. That night, the footsteps returned. Only this time, they were heavier. Closer. I sat up in the tent, my heart pounding in my chest. The fire had died down to embers, casting long shadows across the clearing. I could hear breathing outside, deep, raspy breaths just beyond the fabric of the tent. "Jake," Kelly whispered, her voice trembling. "What is that?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. The fear clawed at my throat, rendering me speechless. Slowly, I reached for the flashlight, but before I could turn it on, Sam's voice cut through the silence. "Guys, you awake?" His voice was low, coming from outside the tent. But something was wrong. The voice wasn't right. It sounded off, like Sam, but distorted, as if someone was mimicking him. "Sam," I whispered, "come outside. I need help with something." I felt Kelly's hand grip my arm, tight with fear. "That's not Sam," she hissed. "Jake, that's not him." I didn't want to believe her, but the sinking feeling in my gut told me she was right. I grabbed the flashlight and flicked it on, aiming the beam at the entrance of the tent. Slowly, I unzipped the door, the zipper's metallic sound cutting through the night. Standing just outside was Sam, or something that looked like Sam. The figure's features were all wrong, stretched, too long, the limbs bending unnaturally. Its eyes gleamed in the light, animalistic, reflecting the beam with an eerie glow. It smiled, but the smile was too wide, too forced. "Come outside, Jake," it said, the voice a warped echo of my friend's. I stumbled back, heart racing, trying to pull Kelly with me as far from the thing as I could. The creature's smile faltered, its expression shifting into something darker, more predatory. Without thinking, I grabbed the silver knife Sam had jokingly packed as part of his cryptid survival kit. In any other situation, I would have laughed at the irony, but now it was the only thing I had, the only weapon that felt remotely safe. I lunged forward, swiping at the creature's arm with the blade. To my shock, the silver seemed to burn its skin, the flesh bubbling where the knife touched. The creature let out an ear-splitting shriek and stumbled back into the shadows of the trees, disappearing with unnatural speed. We didn't wait to find out if it would return. I grabbed Kelly, and we bolted for the RV, throwing everything into the back as fast as we could. Sam, or whatever had been wearing his face, was gone. The real Sam's fate was still a mystery, but one thing was certain: we were getting out. As I drove away, the headlights illuminated a figure standing at the edge of the forest, a coyote watching us, its eyes glowing in the night. It wasn't over, not yet. I had been driving for hours, and the further I ventured into Allegheny National Forest, the quieter the world around me seemed to become. It was the kind of silence that suffocates. No birds, no wind rustling through the trees, not even the distant hum of traffic. Just my RV rumbling along the narrow dirt road, surrounded by an ocean of dense forest that swallowed the light as the sun began its slow descent behind the trees. This place had a way of making you feel small, insignificant. I liked that most of the time. I'd been coming to forests like this for years, chasing solitude, silence, and the perfect photograph. My camera was my lifeline, my way of capturing the world in ways most people never got to see. But this time, something felt different. The old logging cabin I was searching for had been lost to time, its history buried in a few obscure records I'd found during a late-night internet deep dive. It was supposed to be somewhere deep in the Allegheny woods, abandoned after a family disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The locals called it haunted, but I wasn't one to buy into that. Still, it was exactly the kind of thing that made for great photography, and the isolation only added to the allure. I found a clearing just off the dirt road, parked the RV, and shut off the engine. The quiet hit me like a wall, No birds, no insects, just silence. It felt unnatural, but I brushed it off. Isolation was part of the appeal. I stepped out into the cool air and took a deep breath. The trees around me were tall, towering, as if they'd been standing here for centuries, untouched and waiting. I set up camp, stretching out by the fire I'd built to keep the cold at bay. My camera was resting beside me, fully charged, ready for the next day's adventure. The plan was simple. Hike to the old cabin in the morning, spend the day photographing its decayed walls, and hike back before dusk. I didn't want to be stuck out there when night fell, even if I didn't believe in the ghost stories. Still, as the shadows stretched long across the clearing and the firelight flickered weakly against the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The silence pressed down on me, heavy and oppressive, as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just tired. Later that night, lying in the RV, I woke up to something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Footsteps. Soft but deliberate, they crunched through the leaves outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, but they were too heavy, too human. I lay there in the dark, barely breathing, listening as they circled the RV, slow and methodical. My heart pounded in my chest. I grabbed the flashlight, sat up, and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing, just trees and the faint outline of the clearing. My breath came out in the short, nervous bursts. I told myself it was just my imagination. The woods could play tricks on you when you were alone. But deep down, I didn't believe it. Morning came, and the unease lingered as I set out on foot, camera slung over my shoulder. The path wasn't well marked, but I had a rough idea of where the cabin would be, tucked deep in the forest, forgotten by time. The air was still cool, and a low fog clung to the ground, weaving between the trees like fingers reaching up from the earth. After an hour of hiking, I found it. The cabin stood crooked and weathered, barely visible through the thick trees that surrounded it. Its wooden walls were gray with age, splintered and sagging, as if the forest had been slowly reclaiming it. But even in its decay, there was something unsettling about it. The air around the place felt different, thicker, colder, as if the cabin itself exhaled an icy breath. I took out my camera, snapping shot after shot of the exterior before stepping inside. The air within was stale, and the faint scent of rot lingered in the corners of the room. Strange symbols had been carved into the wooden walls, some crude, others intricate, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I studied them. Just graffiti, I muttered to myself, though the words sounded hollow. The cabin had a heavy stillness, as though it had been waiting for me. As I walked through the rooms, each step echoing loudly in the silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I set up my tripod, trying to focus on the composition of the shots, but it was impossible to ignore the prickle of unease that gnawed at the back of my mind. That's when I heard it, a soft, low whisper just behind me. I spun around, the camera clutched tight in my hands. There was no one. The cabin was empty. I tried to tell myself it was the wind, maybe a trick of the old wooden beams creaking in the breeze, but there was no wind. The air was still, dead. I packed up and left quickly, the cabin's presence pressing against my back as I walked away. As I hiked back toward the RV, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following me. But there was nothing. Nothing except the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. Back at camp, I reviewed the photos, eager to see what I'd captured. But something was wrong. The images of the cabin, where I'd spent nearly an hour shooting, were gone. Not corrupted, not blurred, but gone. My camera had deleted them, leaving only a few shots from the hike up. Frustration twisted in my gut. I was meticulous about this kind of thing. I hadn't touched the settings, hadn't made a mistake. But the photos were gone, as if they had never existed. That night, the footsteps came again, louder this time, closer. I sat up in bed, flashlight in hand, waiting. The RV's walls felt paper thin, and the space outside them seemed to thrum with a quiet, malevolent energy. I could hear them, those slow, deliberate steps crunching through the leaves, circling me. I turned the flashlight on, but the beam cut through nothing but darkness. And then, just for a moment, I saw her. She was standing just beyond the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the weak light. A figure, pale and gaunt, her eyes wide and hollow. She was watching me, her head tilted slightly as though trying to understand me. I blinked, and she was gone. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking as I sat there in the dark. I didn't believe in ghosts, not really, but I couldn't deny what I'd just seen. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was exhaustion, a trick of the light, anything to make sense of it. But the truth was settling in, heavy and cold. Something was out there. The next morning, I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I'd planned to spend another few days in the forest, but I had no desire to find out what was going to happen next. I packed up my things, eager to get out. But when I turned the key in the RV's ignition, the engine sputtered, coughed, and died. Come on, I muttered, trying again. But the engine refused to turn over. Panic started to set in. The RV had been fine the day before, and I was miles from any help. My phone had no signal, of course. Allegheny's remoteness was part of its charm, but now it felt like a death sentence. I grabbed my backpack, loaded it with essentials, and decided to head back to the cabin. I had no idea why. Maybe I thought I could find something there, some clue that would explain what was happening. Maybe I was just desperate for answers. The hike back was quicker this time, but the cabin looked different. It was subtle, but I noticed the changes immediately. The door, which had been hanging off its hinges, was now straight, closed as if someone had repaired it. Inside, the furniture that had been broken and overturned was now neatly arranged. I stood there, staring at the room, my breath catching in my throat. It was impossible. No one had been here, but the cabin looked as though it had been lived in, as though the years of decay had been wiped away. Then I heard her again, the whisper, soft and desperate. This time, it wasn't coming from behind me. It was coming from the far side of the room, from the corner where the shadows were deepest. And she was there, standing in the dark. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of fear and anger, and her mouth moved silently as though she was trying to speak but couldn't. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her long dark hair clung to her face in wet strands. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest, but she didn't move. She just stood there, staring at me, her expression twisted with something like sorrow. And then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, she spoke. "Help me." The words sent a chill through my spine, and I stumbled back toward the door. Her eyes followed me, pleading, but there was something else in them, something dark and vengeful. I didn't wait to hear more. I bolted from the cabin, my legs trembling as I ran through the trees, not caring about the path, not caring about anything except getting away. The woods felt alive around me, the air thick and stifling, as though the forest itself was trying to hold me back. Branches snagged at my clothes, roots tripped me up, and all the while I could hear her voice, faint but persistent, calling after me. When I finally reached the RV, I didn't stop to think. I grabbed the lighter fluid from my bag, ran back to the cabin, and doused it. My hands were shaking as I lit the match and threw it onto the wooden walls. The flames caught quickly, devouring the old wood in seconds, and for a moment I felt a strange sense of relief. But as the fire roared, I heard her scream. It wasn't a scream of pain. It was rage, pure, unbridled rage, and I knew, without a doubt, that I'd made a terrible mistake. The wraith wasn't gone. She was furious. The RV started the next morning, but the forest didn't let me leave easily. As I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me. Her eyes, dark and hollow, followed me until I was out of sight. And even now, miles away from Allegheny, I can still feel her presence, waiting. It was supposed to be a simple trip. Just me, my camera, and the open wilderness. I wasn't looking for adventure or danger. No, I came to Coconino National Forest to escape it all. After the divorce, I needed a break from reality, and nature had always been my refuge. But out here, I found something else, something I can't explain. The forest was beautiful, no doubt about that. I'd parked my RV in a spot so remote that even the nearest dirt road seemed like a lifetime away. That was intentional. I didn't want tourists or families with kids spoiling the quiet. I needed the isolation, or at least I thought I did. The first day passed like I expected. I spent hours hiking, capturing shots of the towering pines and jagged red rock formations. I let the rhythm of nature calm my mind. The air smelled like pine needles and damp earth, and the silence. It was what I came for. Total peace. But that night, the silence shifted. It wasn't peaceful anymore, it was oppressive. A thick, heavy quiet that pressed in on me from all sides. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to the solitude I wasn't used to yet. My camera equipment sat in the corner of the RV, all packed up neatly after a long day. I lay down, trying to sleep, but something kept me awake. Something off. It started as a whisper, faint, like the wind barely rustling through the trees. Evan. I sat up, every hair on the back of my neck standing on end. I waited, listening. The forest was dead silent. No animals, no breeze, nothing. I figured I must have imagined it. I'd been alone for a while now. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But then it came again, louder this time. My name, but not in any voice I recognized. Evan, come outside. I froze. It wasn't possible. There wasn't a soul for miles. No one could know my name out here, not unless they followed me from town. My stomach twisted at the thought. Someone could be out there, watching, waiting. I grabbed my flashlight, careful not to make too much noise, and crept toward the window. I scanned the trees with the light, slowly, my heart pounding. The beam illuminated nothing but shadows and pines. Still, that feeling, the one where your instincts tell you someone's nearby, was stronger than ever. I closed the curtain quickly, my pulse racing. It was stupid, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was just beyond the reach of the flashlight, just out of view. Don't be paranoid, I muttered to myself. It's probably nothing. But as I tried to settle back into bed, I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling the RV, heavy enough to be human. I shot up, gripping the flashlight tighter. My brain ran through the possibilities. A ranger? A lost hiker? But no one would be out here in the middle of the night. Not this deep into the forest. I stayed awake for hours, listening to those footsteps until they finally faded. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I convinced myself it had all been in my head. A trick of the mind, amplified by being out here alone. Still, I couldn't help but feel uneasy as I stepped outside. The sun was already rising, casting long shadows over the forest floor. I decided to hike to a new spot to distract myself, hoping to shake off the strange vibe from the night before. I needed to focus on what I came here to do, take photos and forget about everything else. But the forest felt different today. Even the air seemed heavier, as if the trees were closing in on me. The silence, which had been comforting before, was now unsettling. I found myself wishing for the sound of birds or even the rustle of a squirrel, but there was nothing, just an unnatural quiet. I walked for hours, trying to find the perfect spot to set up my tripod, but no matter where I went, the sense of being watched lingered. I stopped to take a photo of the sunlight filtering through the pines, but when I checked the shot on my camera, something strange appeared. In the background, just on the edge of the frame, there was a figure. Dark, blurry, barely discernible. It looked like a person, but I knew there was no one else around. My heart skipped a beat. I zoomed in, but the more I looked, the less sense it made. It couldn't be a person. The shape was too distorted, too unreal. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, maybe a shadow from a tree, but my gut told me otherwise. I packed up quickly and made my way back to the RV, my nerves on edge the entire way. The forest was playing tricks on me. I was sure of it. But by the time I got back to camp, I wasn't so sure anymore. That night, the whispers returned. Evan. It was louder now, closer. I lay in bed, frozen, as the voice called to me again. This time it was more insistent, more human. But there was something else in the voice, something wrong. Come outside, Evan. I wasn't going to fall for it. I wasn't stupid. Whoever, or whatever it was, they wanted me to come outside, and I wasn't about to walk into some psycho's trap. But the whisper kept coming, circling the RV, just like the footsteps from the night before. It was trying to get in my head. I squeezed my eyes shut, covering my ears, but the voice wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was inside, in my mind. Sarah's voice, my ex-wife. Evan, come outside. I'm waiting. That's when I snapped. I grabbed my flashlight and threw open the door, stepping into the cold night air. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. But I knew something was out there. Something was watching me, toying with me. I walked a few paces away from the RV, scanning the area, but there was no sign of anyone. Just that same oppressive silence. My hands shook as I stood there, the flashlight trembling in my grip. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of the light, stood a figure. Tall, thin, and cloaked in shadows. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its body unnaturally still. The thing just stood there, staring at me, though I couldn't make out its face. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I knew it was watching me. It had been watching me since the first night. I ran back to the RV, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't sleep after that. How could I? That thing was out there, waiting, watching. The next morning, I packed up the RV. There was no way I was staying here another night. I hadn't planned on leaving so soon, but something in this forest wasn't right. I couldn't explain it, but I didn't need to. I just needed to get out. But as I was preparing to leave, I noticed something strange. On the trees surrounding my campsite, there were symbols, carved deep into the bark. I hadn't seen them before. They looked ancient, like some kind of warning or marker. My stomach twisted as I realized they weren't there when I'd set up camp. Someone, or something, had been here while I slept. I didn't bother with the camera or my equipment. I left everything behind and started the RV, driving as fast as I could down the winding dirt road that led out of the forest. But no matter how far I drove, that feeling stayed with me. That sense that I wasn't alone, that something was still following me. When I finally reached the edge of the forest, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw it again. Just for a second. A figure standing at the tree line watching me. That was 2 weeks ago. I haven't told anyone what happened out there. Who would believe me? But every night since I left, I've heard those whispers in my sleep. Evan, I don't know what it wants, but I'm afraid one day I'll answer, and I don't think I'll come back.